Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, or whatever time of day you're watching this. I'm Minna Walsh, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Clinical Trials Research Program. And it is my job today in 10 to 15 minutes to go through who's who in clinical trials research. This may be a little bit basic for some of you, but we thought it would be an important introduction for some of you who may not have had a lot of experience in clinical trials research. So this is a summary of what you told us about your experience. You may not be able to see this very well unless you enlarge it, but a large group of you have not had experience as a PI, either at a local site, your own site, or nationally. And you also, many of you have said that you haven't been part of a multi-center trial. Many of you have been sub-Is or sub-investigators at a local site. So I think this will be valuable for you. And I'm going to just go through what you need to know about site investigator work and what the components of these things are. So this is really the anatomy of a clinical trial. We need a sponsor. The FDA is involved, whether it is a pharmaceutical or device trial. There is a steering committee of every trial. There are many core labs, not for every trial, but for some. Most large trials have a data safety and monitoring board, an events adjudication committee. Some trials that are larger also have a publications committee. Every trial's got to have an institutional review board, and any type of research activity that you do on your own, at your own site, if it's investigator initiated, has to go through the IRB as well. Then you need site personnel involved. Sometimes there's a contract research organization, and you always need patients unless you're doing work that's retrospective, involves looking through charts, etc. So the sponsor is the organization that provides the funding for the trial. On the federal level, that would be the NIH, the NHLBI, in our case, in cardiovascular medicine and surgery. PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Institute, is another federal funder, and there are others. And there are national, regional, and local funders, and that might be your own institution or your health system, which might provide funding for you to do your work. Local AHA and national AHA as well is often a source of funding. And then there's other regional, local granting agencies. You may even have some sort of fund that you're aware of in your own institution. And then a lot of trials are sponsored by industry, as I think we all know. So what does the sponsor do? So the sponsor's requirement, the responsibility is for the conduct of the trial, including ensuring that the study meets regulatory requirements with appropriate regulatory bodies. That often means that the sponsor talks to the FDA in advance of even starting the trial. For example, in obtaining an investigational new drug or new device indication, prior to even starting the trial, the sponsor talks to the FDA to determine what will be needed and gets agreement from the FDA on the trial structure and how the trial is going to be done. The sponsor is responsible for selecting investigators, making sure that the site has IRB and executive committee approval before the investigational device or the study drug gets shipped to you at a site. And then the sponsor also has to conduct site monitoring to make sure that patients are being properly consented, the trial's being conducted according to the protocol. And for those of you who have been a PI, you know the copies of correspondence data and shipment and everything is very tightly monitored. So this is all the responsibility of the sponsor, no matter who the sponsor is. So the FDA, as you know, is responsible for safeguarding public health by assuring that current and newer medical products are effective and safe to use. Once a company decides to pursue a clinical trial, it has to first submit an IND, that's investigational new drug, or if it's a new use, they have to submit that to the FDA as well. And then for devices, it's an NDI, as I already stated. So what about the steering committee of a trial? The steering committee is responsible for the independent oversight of clinical trials. And there are guidelines, the Medical Research Council, as you see in the first bullet. The oversight is typically, so the steering committee really is the one that helps the sponsor decide on site investigators. Often the sponsor has some very clear ideas because they've worked with site investigators before. But the steering committee are usually experts in the area of that trial, whether it's in a disease state or some sort of an outcomes trial. And they give guidance to the sponsor, sometimes even can not overrule what the sponsor does, but tell the sponsor that some aspect of the trial isn't correct. So then there's a data monitoring committee as well, and an independent executive or steering committee. And the data monitoring committee makes recommendations up to the steering committee. So the steering committee has a national principal investigator, or often there are co-principal investigators. Sometimes, for example, in trials of, like in my field of heart failure, the VAD trials generally have co-principal investigators from both cardiac surgery and cardiology. And the steering committee's involved in the design of the trial as well. So what about a core lab? So there, as you know, there is data analyzed in many forms in trials. And if there's imaging or exercise data, device downloads, for example, ICD-CRT, biologic specimens or devices, there has to be a core lab. It doesn't have to be a core lab. Some imaging is looked at individually at the sites, and the report of the site, for example, on an echocardiogram, is accepted by the trial. But more often, that imaging goes to a core lab for adjudication. So the core lab is looking at the various pieces of data individually. And the core lab has nothing to do with the trial in that these are not site PIs too. The core lab just does that expertise in imaging. I'm glad you're all getting to see my emails pop in. What about the Events Adjudication Committee, or the EAC? This is a separate committee from the steering committee that's responsible for determining what happened to each subject. So if there's an adverse event or a serious adverse event, the Events Adjudication Committee decides what happened and how this should be categorized. If you, as a site investigator, have an adverse event happen to your patient, you must report that to the sponsor, and the EAC then looks at it as well and decides whether they agree with how you stipulated that adverse event happened. A death is always one of the most adjudicated events. In some trials, it's important to determine what caused the death, whether it was cardiovascular or not. So that the Events Adjudication Committee is separate from the steering committee as well. So let me just walk you through one trial. I was on the Events Adjudication Committee of the SCUD-HEF trial, the sudden cardiac death and heart failure trial, many years ago now. And this was a paper that we wrote many years after the primary trial results were released on what the mode of death was in stable patients with heart failure. So the clinical, I underlined this, the clinical records pertaining to outcome events were reviewed by independent events committee. There were 6 electrophysiologists and 6 heart failure cardiologists. Of note, this was the first trial that involved arrhythmias and devices that actually included heart failure cardiologists in the events, on both the site investigators and in the events committee. So we went through all the documents and determined what happened to each patient. A data and safety monitoring board is separate from the events committee, and it independently monitors what's going on as these events are being reported to make sure that the trial should continue safely. They are not involved in the study, although they have expertise in the area in which is being studied, whether it's pharmaceutical or device. And there are stopping rules for early termination. That generally occurs if patient harm happens, or if there's overwhelming evidence that the study is positive in favor of the device or the new pharmaceutical agent. So this can be, you can all of a sudden get an email, or back in the day, it was a fax that said, stop what you're doing, stop drug, stop device, whatever, because an endpoint has been met. So that's what the DSMB does. Many larger trials have a publications committee that begins at the beginning of the trial. And the rules of the road are generally outlined, like, here's the way you get publications. You enroll a lot of patients. You serve on one of the committees. You have a great idea for a sub-study or a secondary analysis. And the publications committee, if it's done well, should determine these rules for authorship at the beginning. And the reason that publications committees exist is to be fair to investigators and to people who are doing work for the trial so that they can be part of the publication strategy afterwards. The Institutional Review Board can be either at your local site or it can be a national IRB. The primary purpose of an IRB is to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects while they're involved in research activities. And no trial can be undertaken without the oversight of an institutional review board, either your local one at your institution or a national IRB, such as the Western IRB. The rules for IRBs are standard, whether it's at your local hospital or national. And I think one of the important pieces of an IRB is in the fourth bullet. The FDA requires to be qualified as an IRB, you really have to have a diversity of members, including consideration of race, gender, cultural backgrounds, and sensitivity to issues such as community attitudes. And the IRB, if you haven't served on one or presented to one, includes members of the public, people who are not clinicians, researchers. And so those are the individuals who often ask the most interesting questions, I think. So the central IRB is sometimes utilized by trials to make it easier for sites to go through the same process, and it simplifies things, but it depends on your local IRB whether or not they agree that you can use the centralized IRB. And many institutions use their local IRB only for their own internal trials or investigator-initiated studies. And so you have to check with your IRB about these things, because each institution's a little bit different. So at your site, you will have let's say you, the principal investigator, you should have a research administrator, some administrator who's going to help you navigate all the contracting, et cetera. You'll have an attorney someplace embedded into this structure whom you can turn to for legal advice at times. And then many of your colleagues can be sub-investigators, people who work with you every day in your field. You might offer them to be sub-investigators. Many of you filled out your surveys and said you already had been sub-investigators. And it's one of the first things that we do for after we have somebody come on board in an institution, you say, hey, you want to be a sub-I in this trial? Because it sets you up really well to then become a principal investigator the next go-round. You do have an IRB, and then the invaluable nurse coordinators are necessary to make a trial run at a site. So if you're the PI, what do you have to do? You are responsible for selecting and enrolling subjects. You alone are assuring compliance with IRB policies. It may be your coordinators or your administrator who are making this all happen, but ultimately the responsibility is your own. And you are responsible for reporting and recording adverse events. Serious adverse events generally have to be reported to the sponsor within 24 hours, and it rests on the PI's shoulders to make sure this happens. I already talked to you about the policies of the institution and whether or not you can use a central IRB. So being a principal investigator is great. It's fun, but it does carry with it responsibility. And even if your coordinators are outstanding, your administrators are outstanding, you have to remember that the responsibility for conduct of the trial at your site is your own responsibility. I wanted to say a word about a contract research organization, because sometimes a sponsor, like a company, will interpose between the sites and themselves, a contract research organization, because the sponsor, say an industry sponsor, doesn't have the personnel that can run the trial. So a CRO is a company that can do all the things that the sponsor needs done, like to come in, look at your site, evaluate how you're doing with reporting your adverse events and things like that. And then they report back to the sponsor. So you may be dealing on a local level only with the CRO, with the personnel from the CRO and not the sponsor. Every sponsor is a little bit different. The larger companies are able to run the trials themselves. And importantly, subjects. These are 2 patients of mine and 1 spouse over there on the wife of the patient. These are dear people to me, both deceased now, by the way, but they both gave permission for me to use pictures in in my lectures, and they both have LVADs. The lady, by the way, has hers in a MACC purse. For those of you who know what MACC is. So anyway, these both were subjects in Momentum 3. And I think we have to all pause and say research wouldn't happen without our dear patients and volunteering to be subjects in trials. So I just wanted to show you a fairly recent trial, Partner 3, and just kind of go through all these various things I just said and how does that play into this one trial. So Edwards Life Science was the sponsor of Partner 3. The principal investigators were Michael Mack and Marty Leon. Here's the steering committee. Sidebar, not as diverse a steering committee as one would have hoped, and hopefully things are changing in that regard. That's part of why we're having the CTR program, so that we get some diversity into the ranks of steering committees. And then the DSMB was run by the Cardiovascular Research Foundation, and the chair was Dr. Carrazza. The Clinical Events Committee was Cardiovascular Research Foundation, and this chair was Stephen Marks. There was a CT and an Echo Core Lab, and you see where that work was done. 2 different universities with the various chairs that I have listed there. And then this, just for the same trial, Partner 3, this is the site investigator page that you would have had to sign, or your interventional structural colleagues would have to sign to say, yes, I agree, I'm going to do this. This is my site name, and I'm going to be responsible. And this is the case review board. This is something else that you would have to look at. This is part of the document as a site PI you would have to know about and agree to. And this is how you would, if you were becoming a site PI, you'd have to look at what your responsibility is to report AEs, how you should categorize them, and then how the sponsor is going to assess them later. And then just more on adverse events analysis. So this is the kind of paperwork you'd be looking at to become a site PI for this particular trial, the Partner 3. And then, as I said about the DSMB, the periodic analysis will be performed, and this is just information that's given to you as a site PI about how the trial will be conducted. So this is my last slide, and I leave you with this. These could be your future roles, and we hope that the CTR program is going to launch you toward these. You could work for the FDA. There are several cardiologists who do, either on a part-time basis or some full-time. You could be a member of a steering committee if you haven't been. If you are especially an imager, you could be a core lab at your site and chair that. You might be a member of the DSMB or an events committee. You might be on a publications committee. It's usually some fairly senior people get on that. You can always be on your own IRB, and they probably need you. There's a need for clinical investigators to get on the IRB. And then site personnel. I hope all of you, as a result of the CTR program, are going to become site investigators. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to look forward to in-person questions with you when we have the live program. Thanks.